Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be.
And it will probably be the most important vote you ever cast. And this election is more than
In the 2020 US election, a record-breaking 2/3 of eligible Americans cast their ballots, underscoring the intensity of the moment. But this year, the stakes were even higher, as American politics has reached another pivotal crossroads.
This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
And now, for only the second time in US history, a former president returns to the White House after a 4-year absence. Donald Trump's comeback brings bold promises for the economy, immigration, and concerns over America's role on the global stage. And what does this result mean for the country and the world? Today, we dive into this historic shift of power in Washington with Nathan King, CGTN's White House correspondent. It's Friday, November the 8th. So, Nathan, I assume this is not the first election you've covered?
No, in fact, my first election, and just after I moved to the United States, was Bush versus Gore. And do you remember the drama? It all came down to ballots in Florida. There was recounts, there was lawyers, and it all went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's, of course, when George W. Bush was controversially given the presidency by the Supreme Court. So I'm no stranger to American elections and no stranger to controversy either. And they usually are very close-run things.
With your rich experience in covering the story, is this year really the most important election as claimed by both two candidates?
Yeah, I mean, every election is the most important election since the last one. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the change in American society. Let's face it, Donald Trump is the first now president-elect to run for office, win, lose the second attempt, and then win at the third attempt since Grover Cleveland in the 1880s. But also it means that he's dominated the discussion of American politics for 12 years. And it really is a shift in the sort of establishment politics that we've seen since the 1980s, really. And as you know, President Trump is not a political insider. He comes with some critics would say, erratic style. And so it's a very different approach that we've seen from other presidents. Even though you have right or left, Republican or Democrat, Trump really breaks the mold in lots of ways.
It was interesting that, as we were discussing earlier, that a lot of people were expecting drama in the battleground states. And that's what was predicted from a large number of polls before the election, that they were expecting a tight race, especially in the battleground states. But all 7 of them have voted in favor of Donald Trump. So what led to this contrasting discrepancy between the polls and now the voting result?
Well, I think actually it was close, but it was just close in lots of states that were swing states, and Donald Trump won them all. I mean, if you look at the polling margin of error, he won by less than 1%, 2%, 3% in all those states, but they all went for him. And so we have to dig underneath the polls and look at what happened. And what's incredible is that, the Kamala Harris campaign had really banked on women turning out, especially because of the discussion over abortion here in America. And they did, but not to the extent that they had hoped. Women generally vote in larger numbers than men by about 3 or 4 percentage points. But what Donald Trump was very able to do, and the Republican Party in general, was turn out male voters, especially white male voters from working class areas, especially the suburbs in places like Michigan, around Detroit and Milwaukee in Wisconsin. We're talking Harrisburg and Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, hence the blue wall was destroyed. But also despite all the controversy over certain remarks at some of his rallies about Puerto Ricans, etc., he really did tap into, how Americans slice and dice the electorate into categories, which I really don't like all the time. But Latino men really moved towards Trump. Now, even though the Democratic Party has still a majority of Latinos, African Americans, there was a swing. And all you need is a 3 or 4% swing in every area to win the election. Polling and politics is a real science in America because they have constant elections. And he was able to do that.
Yeah, so you really have to look into the demographics. As you look deeper, it's going to look tighter than it looks like from the big picture.
Yeah, but also, I mean, there's some an undercurrent here, which is that even though, you can say it was 50,000 maybe Muslim voters who were angry at the Gaza policy in Dearborn, Michigan, who swung it for Trump, and there's this group here and that group here, there's an underlying thing here. Because if you look at even the blue states, the Democratic states, like New Jersey, for example, even in New York, Kamala Harris's margins were so much tighter than they were in 2020 for Joe Biden, just 5% lead in New Jersey, which has been solidly blue for generations. Even California, which Biden wins by 20%, it's 15%. That's her home state. So there's just a broader realignment going on here, which are, pollsters, politicians, and everyone is trying to get their handle on. But, it's in representative democracies, it's been a terrible couple of years for incumbents. And I think that might be just the most obvious point. Right. Biden administration presided over record levels of inflation not seen since the 1970s. And people really felt it in their pockets. And no matter what other issues you have, whether it's immigration, abortion, foreign policy, whatever, people just didn't feel better off than they were 4 years ago.
So during the election, there were still dramas going on. At least 12 voting stations in Georgia had to stay open longer because of bomb threats.
Right.
And the White House and Trump's personal estate in Florida had elevated their security levels. And there are even some states that have deployed snipers and drones to prepare for potential violence. Yeah, so why is this election shadowed with such a tense atmosphere?
Yeah, it really is a sad side of American democracy that the political climate has become so fraught, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And even though a lot of these threats turn out to be benign, you could really feel the tension leading up to this race.
Right. Did you feel?
I live in Washington.
Did you feel the tension during reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone was boarding up in Washington, D.C. ahead of this vote. There were huge amounts of police on the streets. The White House had a ring of steel around it, like we felt on and Congress.
They're taking the North Front scaffolding
in the January 6th insurrection. They pretended it was preparations for the inauguration. But that's on January 20th. I mean, you could really feel it palpably. And I think there was a feeling that this election could have really resulted in violence. And I think one of the real plus sides of the emphatic nature of the Trump victory is that no one can say there was voter fraud. No one can say that no one's respecting the results. Kamala Harris conceded graciously. And so American democracy, although tainted, threatened, obviously flawed, because, it's not a uniform system, and so many states try and gerrymander the result, suppress votes, or try and encourage votes in certain areas. It really is, from the local level on upwards, it's not a uniform, smooth system. There's, I hate to use the word corruption, but there's definitely partisanship all the way along, especially when involved with money as well. So, I think America is breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief. Even if they didn't vote for Trump, was an emphatic result. There are no legal challenges, and everyone's accepting it.
So people can finally sign with relief.
For now, because you never know with America. I mean, you remember, in Trump's first term, they had COVID, but also the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests. That really, really led to a very toxic political environment.
Instabilities.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing about the American system, is that everyone praises it when they read the Constitution or the Federalist Papers, but it really is on a knife edge all the time. And, I've been listening recently to history of the 1968 election. You remember when LBJ stood down like Biden not to run for a second term because of the chaos in Vietnam? Remember, there was an assassination of Martin Luther King that year. There was an assassination of former President Kennedy's brother who was running for the nomination. So this is a long trend in American politics. They like to, the Carter Center and everything, talk about democracy abroad. But I can tell you, their democracy is always very, very fragile, and people know it. And there's a huge amount of, community exhaustion every cycle we go through, because it's just so worrying.
So people were really nervous before the election result came out, right?
Absolutely. And, this distracts people from their normal lives, distracts economic activity, distracts from consensus, in society and business and everything. So even though it may be very exciting for people like me and you,
but at the same time,
it's quite distracting, yeah.
Before the election, there were attorneys general from 47 states and 3 U.S. territories called on citizens to be peaceful and condemn in advance any act of violence related to the results. But now, with Trump's victory, do you think this concern of peaceful transition of power, do you think these concerns still remain?
I think the emphatic victory has taken some of the nervousness out of the system. But remember, in the lead up to this election, we had an assassination attempt against Donald Trump.
Right.
There was another plot that was stopped before it could happen. And the unique thing about the American political system, I'm British, as you can tell, when the prime minister is voted out, the next day, the next prime minister comes in. But there's this period now between November 5th and January 20th, where you have a president-elect, and then this inauguration. And this is a very worrying time for authorities, because even though he's won emphatically, not on a landslide, but emphatically, there is still this huge partisan nature in the country. And if I was a Secret Service officer or, I'd be very worried in this lead-up because the country is still so divided. I was encouraged slightly by Donald Trump's remarks on his victory speech in Florida, that he talked about healing the nation, etc. It wasn't full of the vitriol that we are used to, whether it's rhetoric or not, of his other speeches. And also Joe Biden has said, come to the White House, let's work on the transition. Harris was gracious in her defeat as much as she could be. So, there is that sort of calming, the lowering of the temperature a little bit.
Right.
But at the same time, the American political culture, and let's face it, there's a lot of guns in this country, and you never quite know,
And now let's look at the next 4 years under Trump's presidency.
Right.
So during this election, economy has been virtually the top voter issue throughout this whole election.
As it is everywhere, yeah.
How does the president-elect plan to tackle the economic issues, especially the cost of living crisis?
I think this is an excellent question because, if you look at the sort of front pages of the Western magazines like The Economist and stuff like that, America's economy has never been stronger, growing at 5%, all the other Western economies are not. It's a complete success story. But that is not the feeling I've got on the ground traveling around America.
For ordinary Americans.
Yeah, well, also, the inflation numbers were just horrible in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. You know, everyone talks about eggs and stuff like that, but it was everything. Every service he wanted. I remember my haircut going up from $15 to 30. It's just incredible. You're just paying like double sometimes for things that you just take for granted that would cost a little bit, but not really go, ooh, that's a sticker shock. And so that really affected it. And I think there was a real sense amongst the vast majority of the American population who live paycheck to paycheck. They don't save like they're in China. You know, everyone's living on credit. That essentially they were being lied to by the economists, the national media, and the politicians that things were getting better when they just felt like things were getting worse. And remember, with inflation, even though if it comes down, prices still rise. It's just at a lower rate of rising. So, you know, eggs are still expensive, but just less proportionally if you happen to get a pay packet that increases over time. So, I mean, that's huge. With Trump, I think going forward, he talks about tax cuts, and the tax cuts he had in his first administration are actually due to expire next year, and he's going to extend those. And with a friendly Congress, he'll do it. The question is, does it affect the middle and working class? Because generally, he still has this Reaganomics feel of trickle down, where if you cut things like capital gains, corporate tax, etc., then everyone benefits, not just the businesses that are giving it on the top end. There is a lot of research to say that is not always the case. So I think that the middle classes that have voted for him in droves want to see something else. Interest rates are coming down, which is fortuitous for him. Inflation is coming down. So he might be in the sweet spot, if you like, where he can claim credit for something 6 months into his presidency, where essentially the economic cycle was going anyway. But the other thing is the debt. I mean, the U.S. national debt is out of control. And as you know, he's talked about bringing Elon Musk in to cut government spending. The trouble is there's so much of it is just earmarked for certain things, like, you know, nearly $1 trillion for the Pentagon, for example, and in the CIA, it's probably over that, but it's a bit secret. Things like Medicare are ring-fenced, pensions, etc. So he doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver unless you have a growing economy. But the debt is starting to get to a point where even the bond markets are saying, well, there needs to be a change over time. So the typical Republican response, and I don't know if this will be from Trump, is to cut spending in terms of welfare, healthcare spending, education, etc., etc. And we'll see what happens.
Did you have to reduce the frequency of your haircut over the past few years?
No. Luckily, I don't have a lot of hair left.
Right.
So I can wait a longer time in between haircuts.
Still keeping them fresh for the cameras.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, the good thing about when prices go up is you start looking for cheaper things, right?
Alternatives.
Yeah, exactly, alternatives. So in a way, it encourages you to be a bit more frugal, you know?
Exactly.
You know, you don't take the kids to Shake Shack, you take them to McDonald's.
Do you think the issue for the cost of living crisis has more or less affected
This election is not what we wanted.
Kamala Harris's campaign for her role in the current administration for the past 4 years?
Not what we voted for.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the cost of living crisis, and I think the Biden administration really didn't address people's concerns early on because they were doing all the right things if you're in the Federal Reserve or Wall Street and everything like that, you know, but rising interest rates, mortgage rates, of course, going up, more for your car loan, more for everything. You can't explain to people on a day-to-day level who really don't put politics or macroeconomics on their agenda as they're dealing with their family lives. And they did a terrible job at that. And they really didn't explain also the investments they made in the economy when it comes to sort of the green transition or, you know, even though it's controversial, reshoring, manufacturing jobs. There's nearly 1 million manufacturing jobs created here in the United States from the last 4 years. You know, whether you say that's economically advisable. Well, I mean, they did it, they had a terrible communications shop. And I think Biden was one of these incredible politicians who's had 40 years in Washington. But, that's just a bit of a disconnect from the people.
Right.
And I think his age obviously played into that as well.
On the Joe Rogan podcast show, Trump had proposed that eye-catching idea to just eliminate individual income tax and to just make up the lost tax revenue with far-reaching tariffs. How practical could that be?
Well, the secret is in America is that very few people actually pay income tax. I think it's about 40 to 50%, because the thresholds on when you start paying
It's
are
pretty
quite high. Yeah. You're taxed in lots of other ways, consumption taxes, for example, sales tax and insurance contributions on your paychecks. But eliminating income tax has been one of these ideas, especially in Republican circles, for decades now. And there's been even talks of just replacing it with a higher sales tax, like sort of VAT in Europe, value-added tax. And essentially you tax consumption rather than work. And let's face it, that is actually quite redistributive. Like, if you wanted to buy a multi-million-dollar yacht and it's taxed at 30%, that's better than taxing a poorer person working as a janitor at 30%. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And you get more money.
Right.
But it would require a massive, overhaul of the system. Now, tariffs, we're talking China here. We know that tariffs have been an absolute disaster in terms, and added to inflation. I mean, if you look at some economic reports, 4 or 5% on top of what it was, because it's not China who pays, for example, or Europe. It's the companies that buy it, and then they tack that on to the consumer. So if you bought a wonderfully made bike from Guangzhou at $80 2 years ago, it would be $120. Now, not everyone needs a new bike all the time, but you need lots of other stuff too. And if everything's taxed at, this threat of 60% tariffs on China, really? Is that really going to be applicable in a essentially global economy? I mean, there's all this talk of decoupling, but as you know, trade between US and China has never been stronger. So it's a bit of a canard. And also, obviously, it's not just China, but a tariff of 10 to 20% on Mexico, Canada, your nearest trading partners, where you have a trade deal with Europe. That's going to lead to reprisals, higher prices for everyone, and a slowdown in global trade. They've talked about economic pain, but it will still stimulate the US economy. And it would, like a World War II economy, where suddenly you have furniture manufacturers reappearing in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but all the furniture would be 60% more expensive. So I don't know if it's going to happen. I think, Trump wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, right? He's known on The Apprentice and all this sort of stuff. And he likes to float these sort of ideas where everyone freaks out and then do it in. He's extremely transactional, which is actually a good thing. Because a lot of American policy, foreign policy, has always had these ridiculous riders of their view of human rights or their view of democracy, although they never suggested the Electoral College to anyone. When you're transactional, you deal with people at with their national interests, your national interests, etc. But the problem is the rhetoric worries everyone.
Right. And of course, economy is not the only topic that Trump has made many bold promises. Also on immigration.
We're going to have to seal up those borders, and we're going to have to let people come into our country.
Trump has said there will be mass deportations, a crackdown on asylum at the border, and a ban on mortgages for undocumented immigrants. And there also seems to be a national consensus at a large scale for tighter grip at the border. So do you think that Trump's winning mean that the U.S. will be closing its doors to a lot more people for the next 4 years?
I think that's true, yes. But it's on what scale? Again, like he was talking about the 60% tariff, will it happen? I don't see 25 million people being deported from this country. Purely because and this is the untold, well, it's not so secret, is that immigration in this country has made it the success it is.
Right.
From the 1700s onward. And every new wave of immigrants takes the jobs that the last wave of immigrants don't want to do anymore because they become economically more successful. So we're talking about picking fruit. We're talking about cleaning offices. We're talking about cleaning your toilet. Even if you're lower middle class in America, you have a cleaner, you know? So all these people come from outside and they work their way up, or as much as they can do. And huge amounts of industries, from meat packing to fruit picking, rely on immigrant workers, whether they are legal or not. And in my travels around the US, let's just say a lot of companies don't inspect documents like they should because they need the workers.
Right.
There is a short supply of workers.
Of labor force.
And so, yeah, exactly. And they need it. So as a candidate, you may say, I'm going to deport everyone, because people are worried. They do feel that they're depressing wages. They do feel that sometimes their societies change. You remember that horrible allegation about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, in Springfield?
Right. During the campaign.
It was pure rhetoric. But, you may think, oh, my God, he's never going to be elected. But this tapped into these, people's fears sometimes outweigh their rationality, right? And a lot of societies have changed even through legal immigration. But America always has. And there's always been an action and a reaction to immigration. But as you know, 95% of the American population are all from somewhere else originally. You don't have to go that far back.
Now with Trump winning the presidency, the Republican claiming majority in the Senate, and a possible conservative Supreme Court. So do you think there will be just no obstacles for the president-elect to put his policies into practice?
I think he will have a smoother path than he did 8 years ago, because he's learned from, remember, he had no political experience, didn't know how the machine works, how to work legislation through. He now knows. And he's going to bring in people that, instead of trying to slow down and dilute some of his more controversial policies, are going to be right on board. So Speaker Mike Johnson, leader in the Senate, that slim majority, and he probably will be again if Republicans keep control of the House, we'll know in about 10 days, 2 weeks, has said this would be the most ambitious first 100 days of the presidency in terms of legislative agenda in a long while. So they're going to be in a hurry. And remember, Trump can't serve another term. He's got 4 years. And he doesn't have to get re-elected, which means he can be controversial.
We've been discussing the next presidency from economy, from immigration, but now zooming back to the big picture. So just overall, under Trump's administration, what's the outlook for America? Like, how might the world's largest economy be like for the next 4 years?
Really good question. Is it America first, i.e., you put your own national interests over those of your allies? Remember, the Biden administration continued a lot of Trump administration policies when it comes to international affairs, but they tried to play nicer with allies, from Japan to Germany to France, rather than say, why are we paying all this money for your defense, etc. But there was also another feeling in the first Trump administration that it was America alone. And I think we're going to see more of that. And this is just purely on history, not what's going to happen. But Trump has a real aversion to military engagement. We saw him actually do a deal with the Taliban over Afghanistan. Obviously, Biden's withdrawal was chaotic, but the Trump team set the stage for that. He really has said the conflict in Ukraine would not have happened on his watch, and they would not have encouraged Kiev to stand up like they have with billions of dollars of weapons. And that is one big question mark. Also, when it comes to the Middle East, even though the Trump administration seemed very, very much closer to the Netanyahu government in Israel, he got elected with Palestinian support, especially in Michigan. And again, he doesn't like war because he knows it costs money, and he may like doing arms deals, but he doesn't want those arms to be necessarily used. So he's much more of an isolationist president. He believes in building up a fortress America, a strong defense. But remember, America is probably the most ideally geographically placed superpower there ever has been. It has a friendly northern neighbor, Canada, has a friendly southern neighbor, Mexico, after they conquered all their territory 150 years ago. But and they have two very long coasts, which are a long, long way away from people. And Trump feels that. I mean, when it comes to issues such as maritime issues in the South China Sea, Taiwan, the tensions between the Republic of Korea and Japan, he really doesn't care that much. He just doesn't see it as America's interest. Likewise, when he looks at NATO, he says, hang on a minute, we've just been given, and this is his people's language, not mine, we've been giving these people a free ride, we're protecting their continent, why don't they step up? And you're already seeing, this thing called Trump proofing, where essentially last year or so, everyone's around the world is trying to proof themselves from a Trump presidency. So you've seen, a European defense spending go on now. Talk of, manufacturing arms on their own continent properly, rather than just buying it from American corporations or taking whatever they get from NATO. More of a strategic policy. You've seen changes in Japan, for example, right? A much more, hang on a minute, muscular, we could maybe defend ourselves, etc., and also have a more forward-looking strategic policy in our neighborhood. Of course, has all sorts of ramifications. Republic of Korea. The problem is for any superpower like the US is that if you don't control things, you lose influence. And all the institutional people obviously worried, as are in China, about nuclear proliferation, for example. If Republic of Korea takes its defense away from the US umbrella, then it might develop nuclear weapons. You can say the same for Japan, Saudi Arabia. So all these factors have to be played in. But Trump's instincts essentially is fortress America, America alone, unless it's in America's interest.
The next president is very likely to focusing internally on the domestic problems in America.
Yes, and that does not necessarily have just domestic ramifications. I mean, we mentioned the tariffs, for example.
Right.
But it also means, and I think this is one of the less talked about sides of Donald Trump's policy, is that he's much happier in a multipolar world than the Biden administration or the Obama administration were. Even though they want America to be the strongest, they really don't have the same attachment to the post-World War II institutions that the US helped build up, like NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, than the establishment have had on both parties for the last 70 years. And that, to me, is very interesting, is that when the US decides to step back and concentrate on itself, which, let's face it, that there's huge domestic problems, and that might be rightly so, does that mean that actually world tensions lessen a little bit? I mean, let's face it, on the Biden administration, there have been more wars than the Trump administration.
Right. There are definitely expectations on a more peaceful world. Thank you very much for your time, Nathan.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you. Really good to talk in depth.
Relations between China and the United States faced intense trade and economic tensions during Trump's first term. Now, as he returns to the White House, Beijing's reiterated its commitment to a steady and consistent policy toward Washington. In a congratulatory message to President-elect Trump, Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized the importance of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, President Xi also underscored that a stable, constructive, and sustainable China-US relationship not only benefits both nations, but also aligns with the aspirations of the global community. As Trump prepares to shape his second term, the world will be watching closely to see how this complex relationship unfolds in the years ahead. That brings us to the end of this episode of Deep Dive. If you enjoyed what you just heard, don't forget to follow us on your podcast platforms. Just search for Deep Dive. You can also leave comments to let us know what you want to learn about China and beyond. This episode is brought to you by me, Li Yingqi, and my colleagues Zhang Zhang and Qi Zhi. Special thanks to CGTN reporter Nathan King. I'll see you in the next one.